listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and today I'm going to be discussing the IAB's Podcast Advertising Revenue Study that just came out for 2023. I'm recording this on May 10th, and this study just came out yesterday. It is definitely one of my very favorite reports each year. And of course, the reason is because it has everything to do with revenue in the podcast advertising space. How much did we bring in? Did we hit our goals? What are we expecting to achieve? So as would be expected from 2022 to 2023, we did not see the types of increases that we are accustomed to in the podcast space. There was a 5% growth. We were at $1.9 billion in sales, which is lower than we had expected. The IAB had anticipated that we would break the $2 billion mark, and we didn't, which was really disappointing. I will say that they are predicting that we will get to $2.6 billion in 2026. James at Pod News this morning laid out the IAB's predictions and kind of showed where they had made predictions and where we had and hadn't made those. So who knows if we're actually going to get to $2.6 billion? It's hard to say, but it is nice to see a projection out there. And of course, it would be great to get over that $2 billion mark. Now, as we're looking at podcast advertising revenue, I think it's really important for us also to look at digital advertising revenue. The IAB put out the digital advertising report in April of 2024, and that was for the year of 2023. And we saw that digital advertising was at $225 billion and saw a growth of 7.3% year over year, which certainly was not super substantial in the digital advertising space either, but higher than where we are here in podcasting. Now, I think it's really interesting for us to look at what makes up digital advertising. So there are a few categories. First, we have search, display, video, audio, and then an other category. And it's interesting just to look at the percentages. So search makes up almost 40% at 39.5. Display is 29.4, but also did have the largest decrease year over year. And then we also saw that video was at 23.2, other was at 4.9, and then audio is at 3.1. So audio is the smallest share of any sort of digital advertising. But one of the things that I do think is really fascinating is that when you look at just digital audio, that we have seen really, I would say, pretty substantial growths year over year. So when we look at the growth between 20 and 21, there was a huge growth spike. And that was 57.9%. Then between 21 and 22, we saw 20.9. And between 2022 and 2023, we saw 18.9%. So when you're looking at the growth from each of the categories, audio saw the biggest growth by quite a lot. Search only had a 5.2% growth, display only a 4% growth, and then video was at 10.6. So, there really has been a lot that has happened within the audio space. And I will say that when we're thinking about digital audio, it's going to compile a few different things, right? So we're looking at not only podcasts, but of course, all of the streaming as well. And so that's important for us to look at, right? That we know that there is more being spent in audio than just in podcasting, which is fine. But how, I think for us, the question is, how do we get that revenue over into podcasts? So, audio, this report says audio, which includes podcasts, streaming music, and streaming radio, continues to achieve strong growth while accounting for $7 billion in revenue, which is an 18.9% increase, which is, what I had said. So it's really fascinating to me to look at the fact that $7 billion is being spent in audio, and yet in podcasting, we're having a difficult time I don't know if difficult's the right word, but we haven't cracked that $2 billion mark. So I think that those are really important observations for us to look at. Other things that I just wanted to highlight in this report, going back specifically to the podcast revenue report, is that we have just seen tremendous growth. So between 20 and 21, 72% growth, which, I mean, that is just phenomenal. And then between 21 and 22, we saw a 26% increase. And so I think for some of us, it feels like 5% is nothing. And I will say, going back to 2015, which is where the report, stops reporting, we have seen double-digit growth every year. The smallest growth was between 19 and 20, which was 19%. And so 5% does feel really, feels really small. But I think that it had a lot to do with the overall market conditions in 2023. We know that ad dollars were being pulled back as the economy appeared to be weak, and I know that that certainly did have an impact. Other things that I think are really interesting for us to consider are where the dollars are being spent. So, what types of industries are placing these buys. The report says that there was a noted increase of share between the CPG and retail brands, up 4 and 5%, respectively. So, I think that that is really interesting to see that we're getting more of those dollars. In the digital advertising report, it claims that a large percentage of the spending are with the top 10 and 25 largest companies out there. And really, we need to figure out how to get those funds, as we've talked about so much, over into the podcasting space. But, we're seeing increases, which is good. And in terms of where the advertisers are spending, we see that comedy and sports are the top two. News is also right up there. But I think that there's a place to talk about the other categories in order of spending. Were society and culture, true crime, TV and film, business, history, health and fitness, religion and spirituality, and science. So I think it's important for us to look at that those categories were large enough in their spending in those particular genres for them to be called out on a report. And I think, no one's super shocked that comedy and sports and news, society and culture, that's where a lot of the spending is going to be. Sometimes I do have to laugh a little bit that only 6% of the share went to true crime, because I'm pretty sure true crime takes up like 75% of the shows out there. I don't know, actually, but I just think it's kind of fascinating. It feels like there's so many true crime shows to me. So yeah, I think that those are some of the big pieces that are important for us to look at, is where the money is being spent, how the growth looks, and then what the projections are. And, everyone is saying that the growth should be better in 2024. The IAB is predicting a 12% growth year over year, which would be nice, in my opinion, as long as we can stay in those double digits. I'm happy with that. But, time will tell, and so will the economy, because who knows where this economy is headed. I wish that I could comment on that, but my knowledge is not great enough for that. So it will be interesting to see where all of this plays out. But if you haven't had a chance to check out the full report, I would highly recommend that you go and download a copy of it. Just Google the IAB Podcast Advertising Revenue Report, and it will come up. You can also find prior years, which is interesting. And then I would also encourage you to look at the internet advertising. It is the PwC Internet Ad Revenue Report from the IAB, because I do think that it's nice for us to compare what is happening in other advertising arenas as well as what's taking place in podcasting. So I hope this has been interesting for you. I know it was interesting for me to take a look at. Thanks for joining me today. If you haven't checked out my YouTube channel, please head on over there and check out our videos over there, and I will talk to you next week. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.